One of the questions parents often search online when they begin thinking about private school admissions is this: what grades do you need to get into private school? And what surprises many families is that admissions officers are rarely looking for perfect grades at all. In this video, I'm going to walk you through how admissions officers actually interpret grades, why perfect report cards are rarely the deciding factor, and what grades really signal about a child's readiness for a private school environment. Because this question usually appears at a very particular moment. A parent is looking at their child's report card. Maybe the grades are solid but not perfect. Maybe there are a few B's. Maybe one subject is a little weaker than the others. And suddenly the parent starts wondering, is this strong enough for private school? Are other students applying with perfect grades? Does this mean our child won't be competitive? Those concerns are extremely common. Because when families first begin learning about private school admissions, it's easy to assume that schools are simply looking for the highest grades possible. But the way admissions committees evaluate transcripts is actually much more nuanced than most families realize. And once families understand how grades are interpreted, the admissions process often becomes much clearer. Welcome to Admissions Insights. I'm Crystal Stone. Each week, I share reflections and patterns I'm seeing from families navigating private school admissions so you can approach the process with more clarity, confidence, and calm. Because trying to figure out this process on your own can feel overwhelming, and my goal is to help you see the bigger picture a little more clearly. So today, we're going to talk about the role grades actually play in private school admissions. Grades are often the first academic signal parents see. Report cards arrive several times a year, and they provide clear feedback about how a student is performing in school. Because grades are so visible, many families assume they play the single biggest role in admissions decisions. Parents often imagine admissions officers reviewing applications and immediately focusing on GPA or letter grades. But in reality, admissions committees are usually looking at the transcripts in a broader context. They're trying to understand the student's academic story, not just the individual grades themselves. When admissions officers review a transcript, they often look for patterns. They want to see how the student performs across different subjects. They pay attention to whether grades are fairly consistent or whether certain subjects clearly stand out as strengths. They also look at how the student's performance develops over time. Is the student maintaining steady performance year after year after year? Or do grades show improvement as the student grows? Those patterns help admissions teams understand how a student approaches learning and how prepared they might be for the academic expectations of the school. One pattern that can be particularly meaningful is academic growth. For example, a student might have struggled in a particular subject early on, but gradually improved. Perhaps the student developed stronger study habits. Maybe they gained confidence in an area that once felt challenging. Admissions committees recognize that students develop at different speeds. They are not expecting perfection from every applicant, but they do look for signs that a student is capable of learning from challenges and continuing to grow academically. That kind of trajectory can be a very positive signal. One way to think about transcripts is that they function almost like a timeline of a student's academic habits. For example, imagine two different applicants. The first student has mostly A's every year, but the teacher comments suggest that the student completes work reliably without necessarily pushing beyond the minimum expectations. The second student might have started middle school with a few B's while adjusting to a more demanding workload. But over time, the grades improve, and the teachers begin describing the student as increasingly curious, engaged, and confident in class discussions. When admissions committees compare those two academic stories, the decision is not always as obvious as parents might assume. The second student's pattern of growth can suggest strong academic momentum. And momentum is something many schools value because it indicates that the student is still developing their academic habits and may continue improving in a more rigorous environment. So when admissions teams read transcripts, they are often paying attention not just to the grade themselves, but to the direction the student's learning appears to be moving. Another important part of the academic picture comes from teacher recommendations. Teachers often provide insights that grades alone cannot show. They might describe how a student participates in class discussions, how the student approaches difficult assignments, or whether the student demonstrates curiosity about the subject. Sometimes teachers comment on work habits, persistence, or the way the student collaborates with classmates. These perspectives help admissions committees understand how the student actually functions in a classroom environment. In many ways, that information can be just as valuable as the transcript itself. Another factor that surprises parents is that admissions committees often read transcripts alongside the broader academic context of the student's current school. Different schools grade differently. Some schools have very strict grading policies, while others may grade more generously. Admissions officers are usually familiar with many of the schools that feed into their applicant pool, so they often have a general sense of how grading works in those environments. They also review school profiles and teacher commentary that help them interpret grades more accurately. This means that the same letter grade can sometimes be interpreted differently depending on the context. For example, a B+ in a particularly demanding classroom might signal strong academic readiness, whereas a transcript filled with easy A's may not necessarily tell the full story about how a student responds to an academic challenge. Admissions officers are used to reading transcripts with that level of nuance. They are not simply comparing numbers across students. They're interpreting academic performance within the context of each student's learning environment. Admissions officers also pay attention to how students perform across different academic areas. A transcript might show that a student is especially strong in reading and writing. Another student might demonstrate stronger performance in mathematics or science. These patterns help schools understand where a student's intellectual interests and strengths may lie. Private schools are not necessarily looking for students who are identical academically. Instead, they're trying to build a community of learners with a range of strengths and perspectives. This leads to another common question parents ask. Can a student with B's still get into private school? For families thinking about private school in the future, one helpful shift is to start looking at report cards a little differently. Instead of focusing only on individual grades, it can be useful to ask a few broader questions. Is my child developing strong study habits? Are they learning how to manage challenging assignments? Are they showing curiosity about the subjects they're studying? Those habits tend to matter a great deal in more rigorous academic environments, because when students arrive at a demanding school, the ability to stay organized, persist through difficult material, and engage thoughtfully in class often matters just as much as the grades themselves. Helping students build those habits early can make a meaningful difference when it comes time to apply. For many families, that question comes from imagining that admissions committees only admit students with perfect report cards. In reality, the range of grades among admitted students is often wider than parents expect. A student with mostly A's and a few B's can absolutely demonstrate strong academic readiness. What matters more is how the student approaches learning overall. Do the teachers describe the student as engaged in class? Does the student ask thoughtful questions? Do they show persistence when work becomes challenging? Those qualities often matter just as much as the grades themselves, because schools are not simply admitting past performance. They're trying to identify students who will continue to grow in their academic environment. When admissions committees step back and review an academic profile, they're usually asking a broader question. Does this student appear ready for the level of work our school provides? Grades are certainly part of that evaluation, but they are considered alongside other factors, including teacher insight, academic habits, and the student's overall trajectory. Admissions teams are trying to understand how a student learns, how they approach challenges, and how they may develop within the school's academic culture. Another helpful thing for families to remember is that private schools are building communities, not just selecting transcripts. Admissions teams are assembling groups of students who will learn from one another, challenge each other, and contribute to the intellectual life of the school. That means they are not simply looking for identical academic profiles. Some students may excel in writing and discussion, others may show particular strength in mathematics or science, others may demonstrate creativity, leadership, or persistence. All of those qualities contribute to the overall learning environment. For many families, the admissions process begins to feel much less intimidating once they understand how grades are actually evaluated. Grades matter, but they are interpreted within the context of the entire application. Admissions officers are not simply counting A's and B's. They're trying to understand the student behind the transcript. They want to see how the student learns, how the student grows, and whether that student will thrive in their academic environment. If you're early in your admissions journey, or you're beginning to think about how to approach the process in a thoughtful, organized way, these are exactly the kinds of perspectives we explore here each week. Because when families gain clarity early, the entire admissions process becomes much easier to navigate. Thank you for being here. If you're navigating private school admissions and want clear guidance each week, consider subscribing so you don't miss future admissions insights. I'll see you next time.